My wealthy uncle claimed he deserved my late father's estate since he was the eldest, and I was too young to handle it. When I refused, he hired a shady lawyer and showed up with fake documents, sneering, "No judge will side with you over me." But the moment the judge pulled out the real will from a sealed envelope, his arrogance shattered, and the final verdict left him screaming in rage. I'm not really the revenge type. I don't usually have time for drama. But this story still makes my blood boil when I think about it. If you've ever dealt with family who think they're entitled to everything just because they're older or richer or louder, you'll get why this hit deep. This is a story about family betrayal, lies, arrogance, and the kind of revenge that you don't even have to plan, because the truth does it for you. I'll try to keep the legal stuff simple, and I won't use any real names except mine. Call me Neil. My mom died when I was 7. After that, it was just me and Dad. He was a Navy vet. Quiet. Hardworking. Never flashy. We lived in White Plains, New York, in the same modest 2-story house he bought back in the late 80s. The mortgage was paid off. No debt. Just a simple life. My dad raised me right. He worked in HVAC and saved every penny. He taught me how to cook, how to change a tire, how to fix a sink. He didn't say, "I love you," a lot, but I never doubted it. We had each other. And that was enough. In 2021, Dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. We caught it late. They gave him 6 months. He made it 4. During those last weeks, he had trouble walking. I quit my job and became his full-time caregiver. I bathed him. Fed him. Stayed up when he couldn't sleep. I didn't leave the house except to get his prescriptions or groceries. He passed away in the living room, holding my hand. No final words, no big speeches. Just a soft breath out. That was it. I was 27. Still living in the house. Still trying to process what just happened when the first bomb dropped. We held a small service. A few friends. Some of Dad's old Navy buddies. Our neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez, brought cookies. And then, halfway through the service, he arrived. My Uncle Maurice. Dad's older brother. The successful one. Lives in Westport, Connecticut, drives a black BMW with custom plates, wears shiny suits to casual events, always smells like expensive cologne. He hadn't visited Dad once during those 4 cancer months. Didn't call. Didn't send flowers. But here he was, hugging everyone, shaking hands like a politician, acting like he just lost a limb. I stood there stunned, barely able to hold my anger in. Then he came up to me. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or, "How are you holding up?" He said this. "Neil, I think it's best if I handle your father's estate. You're young. It's a lot to deal with. I'm the eldest, and I know how these things work." It's what he would have wanted. I just stared at him and said, "That's not how wills work." He laughed. "We'll see about that." Then he walked off like he had already won. It came from a lawyer named Vincent Calero, who claimed to represent Maurice. The letter said Maurice had been named executor of my father's estate, and that all assets, including the house, were being transferred to him, per the most recent will. And it gave me 30 days to vacate the house. No joke. I was being evicted from the home I grew up in. I called the lawyer listed in the letter. No answer. I called again the next day. Still no answer. The voicemail box wasn't even set up. Everything about it felt fake. That's when I remembered something Dad told me after one of his chemo sessions. It was casual, almost like a passing thought. "If anything happens, call James. He's got everything locked down." James Barnett was my dad's old lawyer. Practiced in Yonkers, worked out of a tiny office above a laundromat. No website. No social media. He looked like he still used a flip phone. But the man had a steel-trap memory and a stare that could peel paint off a wall. I told him about the letter. He chuckled. "Maurice always was a snake. Your dad was very clear. The will is sealed at the Westchester County Courthouse. I delivered it there myself. It names you sole beneficiary. He wanted it airtight. James told me not to respond to Maurice or his lawyer. Let him walk into court with that forged paper. We'll crush him." And oh boy, did Maurice walk straight into it. 3 weeks later, I got a notice from the court. Maurice had officially filed a petition claiming his will was the true one. He wanted to be declared the sole beneficiary and executor. His claims? My dad was not of sound mind when he made the previous will. I was emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible. Maurice had paid for the funeral. He didn't. The house was part of the family legacy. and should not be handled by someone so young. It felt like a bad movie script. The will Maurice submitted looked like something typed in Microsoft Word on a Sunday night. It wasn't even notarized. The font was Comic Sans. I wish I was making that up. James referred me to a younger attorney, Rebecca Lynn, who specialized in probate litigation. She was calm, razor-sharp, and terrifyingly efficient. She filed our counterpetition, requesting the court open the sealed original will from the courthouse vault. Rebecca also filed for a forensic handwriting analysis and witness testimonies from 2 of Dad's fellow vets who were there when the will was signed. While all this was going on, Maurice kept sending me texts like, "You'll thank me one day. This is bigger than you. Family legacy matters more than selfishness." I didn't reply. A week before the court date, I saw Maurice parked outside the house. He didn't come to the door. Just sat in his car. When I went out to ask what the hell he was doing, he smiled and said, "You really think a judge will side with you? Over me? I've got money. I've got experience. This is my family's house. You're just a kid." I didn't say a word. I went back inside and wrote down everything he said. I also installed cameras the next day. The court date was set. Westchester County Courthouse. Room 314. Maurice showed up in a tailored gray suit, his lawyer looking like a guy who gets kicked out of dive bars for being too sleazy. They brought 3 character witnesses, golf buddies from his country club. He walked in smiling. Confident. I was sitting quietly at our table with Rebecca and James behind us. The judge was Honorable Lillian Alvarez, and she looked like she'd seen every kind of lie in the book. Maurice stood up and gave a little speech about family duty. How young people make reckless decisions. And how he had always promised to watch over his baby brother's assets. He even got fake teary. When it was our turn, Rebecca stood calm as ever and said, "Your Honor, we request the court open the sealed original will on file, and allow us to enter it into the record." The judge nodded. The clerk brought out a sealed envelope, dated, signed, and stamped. Morris's face changed the moment he saw it. You could see the panic creep in. The judge read through it carefully. Slowly. She didn't rush. She wanted it to sink in. The room was dead silent except for the sound of her flipping the pages. And then, in a clear voice that echoed across the courtroom, "This last will and testament leaves all physical and financial assets, including the home in White Plains and all investment accounts, to Neil, my full name, the testator's son. The will also explicitly denies any claim by Maurice, his full name, citing previous disputes and lack of involvement." Boom. No gray area? No room for misinterpretation. My uncle's face turned to stone. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but Maurice ignored him. He stood up, without being asked, and shouted, "This is a setup. That's not the real will. My brother was confused, he was on drugs. Chemo. He didn't know what he was signing." The judge slammed her gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Maurice." "Now," he kept going, "I was there for him. I paid for everything. The hospital bills, the funeral." Rebecca stood calmly and said, "Your Honor, we have receipts showing Neil paid for all final expenses. We also have surveillance footage from the funeral home, and Maurice was not present at any medical appointments or treatments in the 6 months leading up to the death." The judge turned back to Maurice. "You've presented a falsified will and unsupported claims. I'd advise you to stop digging." He sat down, red-faced, breathing hard. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A few days after the hearing, Rebecca called me. Something strange happened. One of the witnesses to the will, Dad's old Navy friend named Charlie, had reported that someone had called his daughter's phone and told her to convince your dad to stay out of it. Another witness, Mr. Renner, said his mailbox had been ripped open and someone had left a printed article about perjury penalties. It wasn't subtle. Maurice was trying to intimidate the witnesses. We reported it immediately, but it wasn't enough to charge him with anything yet. He was skating on thin ice, and he knew it. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. 2 weeks later, I got served. Maurice had filed a temporary restraining order, claiming I had threatened him, harassed him by email, and trespassed on his property in Westport. All lies. I hadn't gone near his house. I had barely responded to his texts. I certainly didn't email him. But that wasn't the point. He didn't care if it held up in court. He just wanted to make my life harder. Delay the estate process. Smear me in front of the court. Luckily, Rebecca was ahead of him. She immediately countered with proof. Cell tower logs, GPS data from my phone, and security cam footage from my house showing I never left White Plains. The restraining order was tossed in less than 5 minutes. The judge gave Maurice a long look before dismissing him. Still, the damage was done. It messed with my head. It made me second-guess every knock at the door. This one came out of nowhere. At the next hearing, Maurice's new angle was this. I have reason to believe Neil is not biologically my brother's son. Therefore, he's not a legal heir. Even his own lawyer looked uncomfortable with that one. Rebecca nearly laughed. Your Honor, we have birth certificates, hospital records, and DNA proof from a previous medical filing. This claim is absurd. Still, Maurice demanded a new DNA test. We agreed, just to get it out of the way. It matched. 100% my father's son. Maurice looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. His behavior got worse with every loss. He started showing up outside my house again. Sitting in his car, just watching. One time I walked out and asked what he was doing. He said, I've lost everything. This was supposed to be mine. You were a kid. You had nothing. I built a life. I made money. You're just lucky. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I knew what this was really about. He couldn't stand that my father, his own brother, chose me. Not him. Not the successful one. Not the eldest. Me. The quiet one. The one who stayed. The final blow was coming. The court had one last hearing scheduled. This was the big one. The judge would make a final ruling, binding and irreversible, on the estate. On the will. On everything. Maurice had one last trick up his sleeve. And it was going to blow everything up. Or so he thought. Absolutely. Here's part 3, continuing the story with more sharp, dramatic twists while staying consistent with everything established. The pressure is building, and Maurice's desperation is about to explode in a new, dangerous way. Still no ending yet, just deeper conflict. About a week before the last hearing, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name and a smudged postmark from somewhere in New Haven. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It said, You don't know everything about your dad. Ask James what happened in '93. Then decide if you still deserve the house. No signature. No explanation. I called James immediately. He was quiet for a second, then said, I hoped this wouldn't come up. But if Morris is digging this far back, we better talk. Turns out that in 1993, before I was born, my dad had gotten into a serious legal mess. He was in his early 30s, just out of the Navy, working side jobs under the table. According to court records, he was arrested during a bar fight that ended with a guy getting his jaw broken. My dad was charged with felony assault. The guy pressed charges. There was talk of jail time. But here's the thing, the guy was Maurice's ex-business partner. And here's the twist, the fight was set up. Maurice had been running a shady investment scheme, and his partner threatened to go to the authorities. My dad tried to warn the guy off and it escalated. But when it went to court, Maurice cut a deal, testified against my dad, and walked away clean. My dad pled down to a misdemeanor. No jail. But it stayed on his record for years. He never talked about it. James only knew because he'd been brought in for damage control back then. He said my dad told him. Family comes first. I'm not dragging his name through the dirt, even if he deserves it. I sat there stunned. My dad took the fall for Maurice. And now Maurice was trying to use that same history to take everything from me. Not through the front door. Through the basement window. It was the first time I had left the house overnight since Dad passed. I had gone to visit my cousin for her baby shower in Albany, just for the weekend. When I got back, I found papers scattered on the floor. My dad's old military box was open, and a few of his medals were missing. I checked the camera footage. The main cams didn't catch anything. It was pitch black and the basement window was out of range. But the motion sensor near the garage went off at 3:12 a.m. I reported it immediately. Police came. Took fingerprints. Opened a report. Nothing was taken that couldn't be replaced. Except for one thing. The original utility deed to the house was gone. Now, let me be clear, the legal copy was still on file with the city. But the original paper? It was sentimental. Framed. Signed by my dad when he first paid off the house in 1997. Gone. At the next pre-trial hearing, Rebecca dropped a quiet bomb. We've connected a local locksmith in New Haven to someone using Morris's Amex card on the night of the break-in. Same night Neil was out of town. The locksmith claimed the job was to rekey a property where the deed had been lost. He showed them a photo of the document sent to him for ID. It was a picture of our deed. The cops hadn't moved forward yet, but they were circling. Maurice had now stepped from civil fraud into potential criminal burglary and tampering. His lawyer? Gone. Dropped him that same week. Maurice tried to file a motion to delay the final hearing so he could retain new representation. Judge Alvarez denied it. You've had ample time. We are moving forward. He tried to represent himself at the final pre-trial meeting. He showed up alone. No lawyer. No suit. No fake smile. He looked tired. Gaunt. Like someone who hadn't slept in days. He stood up and said, Your Honor, I request all evidence relating to the 1993 incident be brought forward. I believe it's relevant to Neil's moral fitness to inherit the estate. There was a silence. Then Rebecca stood. Your Honor, the 1993 case involved Mr. Maurice, last name, not my client. We have records showing that Maurice instigated the incident and then used it to shift legal liability. If he wants to bring it into evidence, we'll gladly go over every document and request a criminal inquiry into obstruction from that year. Maurice froze. The judge looked at him. Do you really want to go down that road? He sat back down. He didn't say another word. And then, a new will? This is where things went from ridiculous to completely unhinged. 2 days before the hearing, Maurice showed up at the courthouse with a new document. Another will. This one handwritten. Supposedly signed just 2 months before my dad died. Dated while Dad was deep in chemo, barely able to walk. The will said, I leave my estate equally to my son Neil and my brother Maurice. Let them decide together. It was in shaky handwriting and signed, with love. Only one witness name listed, a hospice nurse who, as it turned out, had never worked at our home. We tracked her down. She had worked in Buffalo, not Westchester County. Maurice had faked a nurse's identity. When confronted, he said, I just wanted to be remembered. That's all. The judge didn't accept the will. Obviously. But that moment? That was when I knew. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about property. Maurice didn't want the house. He wanted to erase the fact that my father left everything to me. He wanted to rewrite history. Everything's on the table. The forged wills. The break-in. The past betrayal from '93. The false restraining order. The intimidation tactics. The new will. With the fake hospice nurse. The sealed, original will that's still ironclad. Maurice is representing himself. He has no lawyer. No backup. Rebecca says we don't even need to say much. The facts are lined up like dominoes. All we have to do is tap the first one. But something tells me Maurice won't go quietly. And I've got a feeling this final day in court will be louder than everything that came before. The courtroom was packed. Not because we were famous, but because word had spread. Through courthouse staff, legal assistants, even local journalists, that this was about to be one of the most chaotic estate battles Westchester County had seen in years. I sat on one side with Rebecca and James. Calm. Focused. Maurice sat alone at the other table. No lawyer. No notes. Just a folder filled with copies of forged documents that everyone in the room now knew were fake. The bailiff announced Judge Alvarez. The room stood. She walked in slowly, sat down, adjusted her glasses, and then said, Let's finish this. Rebecca stood and walked the court through a calm, methodical review of the facts. The original will, verified, sealed, and witnessed. The chain of custody from the courthouse vault. Morris's fraudulent version and the forged signatures. The attempted intimidation of witnesses. The restraining order games. The break-in. The false new will signed by a fake nurse. And finally, Morris's attempt to erase all evidence of my father's final wishes. When she finished, she said, This isn't just about property. It's about dignity. About a man's dying choice being torn apart by his own brother. She sat down. Maurice was called to speak. At first, Maurice stood quietly. He looked smaller than ever. Pale. Eyes red like he hadn't slept in weeks. He opened his mouth. Then stopped. Then finally said, voice shaking. He was my brother. Pause. He was my brother. I don't care what your papers say. I knew him. I helped raise him. Our parents were gone, and I took care of everything. Everything. He slammed his fist on the table. He owed me. I bailed him out in '93 when he screwed up his life. I gave him loans. I tried to fix his messes. And then what? He dies and leaves everything to you? You, who never left this damn house. Who never built a thing on your own. His voice cracked. He was shaking now. He pointed right at me. He betrayed me. And you just reaped the reward. The whole room went silent. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But the judge spoke first. Judge Alvarez leaned forward. Mr. Maurice, the court has reviewed extensive evidence. There is no legal basis for your claim. Your actions, filing false documents, attempting to intimidate witnesses, fabricating evidence, are not only unethical, they are criminal. Morris's face broke right then. He looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in slow motion. But it wasn't over yet. The judge turned to me. Mr. Neal, is there anything you want to say before I give the final ruling? I stood up. And for the first time since all this began, I spoke from somewhere deeper than anger. I used to look up to you, I said, staring at Maurice. Even when you disappeared for years. Even when Dad said not to trust you. I thought, maybe you'd show up when it mattered. But you didn't. You came to take. To rewrite. To erase him. And me. He didn't betray you. He just finally saw you for who you were. Maurice looked like he'd been slapped. He opened his mouth. Then stopped. He didn't speak again. Judge Alvarez cleared her throat. The court finds the original will valid and binding. The estate, in full, is awarded to Neal, full name, as per the sealed will on record. All other claims are dismissed with prejudice. She paused. Furthermore, due to evidence of fraudulent filings and attempted tampering, this court will forward all relevant documents to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Gavel down. It was over. Maurice didn't wait. He stood up and walked out, shoulders slumped, not even looking back. No explosion. No final threat. Just a quiet, broken man walking through a hallway lined with stairs and whispers. Outside the courtroom, one of his old golf buddies, who had come to support him, shook his head and muttered. What the hell was he thinking? Another said. That kid deserved better. Rebecca turned to me and asked if I wanted to press charges for the break-in. I told her. Let the DA decide. I'm done fighting ghosts. The house felt different now. Same walls. Same floors. But everything was quieter. For weeks, I kept expecting Maurice to show up. To apologize. To scream at the front door. But he didn't. He went silent. I heard later he sold his Westport house. Took off for Florida. Something about starting over. No one's really heard from him since. I still think about my dad every day. I think about the quiet way he lived, and the even quieter way he handled people like Maurice. How he gave people chances, even when they didn't deserve them. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done the same. But then I remember how it felt to stand in that courtroom and finally speak. Not just for myself, but for him. For my father. And that's when I know, I didn't win out of luck. I won because I stood by the truth. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: family doesn't always mean loyalty. And blood doesn't mean they care about you. Sometimes, the only way to honor the people who loved you is to stand up against the ones who didn't. Even if it hurts. Even if they're family. Because respect isn't inherited. It's earned. And my father earned mine. Every single day.